In this video, we're going to be covering everything that you need to know to get started using your brand new Canon R50 camera. Now, this definitely will be a more beginner-focused video, so we're going to be covering mostly just the basics. If you find that you are a bit more advanced, feel free to skip around using the timestamps in the bottom of the video in order to find maybe different topics that you still need to know about. Let's go ahead and kick this thing off with how to load a battery and SD card into this camera so that we can actually start using it, because that would be important. So the battery door is located on the bottom of the camera, and there's this little lever here that's on the lock position. All we got to do is move that to the open position and the door flings open. Very convenient. Next, we'll take the battery that Canon provides with the camera, and we're going to have the Canon logo facing towards the lens side of the camera. And all you're going to do is slide that in there and press it until it clicks. Now, the SD card also goes into the bottom of the camera in that little slot next to the battery. And so we're going to take an SD card, just a standard SD card, and you want the picture side, the front, to face again towards the lens element. And you're just going to press it down into the SD card slot until it clicks. And now you can close the battery door and move that lever back to the locked position. And now your camera is ready to start being used. Now we're gonna cover where all the buttons are on the Canon R50, starting with the top of the camera. You have your shutter button, how you take your photos, an ISO button, which we will cover a bit later, shutter dial, how you adjust your shutter speed. You have your red record button, how you record your video clips. You have a mode dial, so this will be where you'll select things like manual mode, automatic mode, video mode, things like that. And then lastly, of course, you do have your on and your off switch located on the top of the camera. Now let's see what buttons you have on the back of the camera. Now, most of these you aren't necessarily going to need, but we'll go ahead and cover them anyways. You have a magnify button here on the top, as well as an autofocus lock button. Down below that, you have an information button, your directional and select pad, as well as a menu button, how you get into the menu system, and then the playback button, which is how you see the photos and videos that you've taken. Additionally, you do have a fully articulating touchscreen here located on the back, which is very handy. I love the Canon touchscreens. On the left-hand side here, you do have a microphone jack port. So this is where you're going to plug in any external audio devices that you may have. Additionally, on the right-hand side, you have a USB-C port as well as a micro HDMI port for anything that you might need. You can use the USB-C port to power your camera, for example, or plug it into your computer and use it as a webcam. Now, the last thing we need to cover before we actually start turning on the camera and using it is how to attach a lens, which is really simple. All you're going to do is rotate the R50 body cap counterclockwise to release it and then expose the sensor. Next, you're going to take the rear lens cap off of whatever lens you have. In this case, I have the 24-105 lens, but maybe you have a different one like the kit lens. Either way, that works exactly the same. Again, just rotate counterclockwise to release it, and now you've exposed the back element of the lens. Now, in order to attach it, it's pretty simple. There's a red line somewhere on your lens. It might be on the outside like this, or maybe it's located on the silver ring somewhere on the lens. Either way, there is a red line somewhere. And then on the camera, you have another red line on the mount itself, in this case, the RF mount. So all you're gonna do is you're going to line up those two lines, those red lines, and rotate clockwise until it clicks. Once it clicks, you know that it is properly mounted onto your Canon R50. By the way, guys, just a little pro tip here. The camera body cap and the rear lens cap, they'll actually attach together. It's not anything crazy, but it's just something that maybe you all don't know. That way, when you put it in your backpack, they stay together. Okay, so now that we have a battery, an SD card, and a lens attached to your Canon R50, let's go ahead and switch it on with the on and off switch. Now, if this is the very first time that you've ever turned on your Canon R50, it will ask you to set the time and date, so just make sure you do that before we begin. Now, for me, I am much more video focused, so we're gonna go ahead and set the mode dial from whatever setting you have it on, probably automatic, which is the green A. We're gonna set it to that movie camera icon, which is how you get it into movie mode. So the first thing we're gonna do is go into the menu system of the camera, starting with the first option on the first page, which is shooting mode. Now with this, you are going to be able to select whether or not you want to shoot in automatic mode or in manual mode. Now, if you are more of a beginner, you definitely can select automatic mode, and it's going to do everything for you, including exposing the image and making sure the color looks right and all that fancy stuff. However, This does take complete control away from you, and it's not really what I recommend doing as you start to learn how to record with your R50 camera. So we're gonna actually go down one and select manual mode for the purposes of this tutorial. Now back into the menu system, we're gonna wanna go down one option to movie record size. Go ahead and click into that. And here it looks a little bit complicated, but don't worry too much about it. Basically, we are deciding what resolution and what frame rate we're wanting to record in. Now, if you're using a computer that maybe doesn't have a ton of space, or you're using SD cards that don't have a ton of space, you may want to record in full HD, which is 1080p. But for me, I much prefer as much resolution as I possibly can, so I'm going to select one of the 4K options. The other thing that you're able to control is your frame rate. Now, for most everyday videos, you're going to want to record in 24 frames per second, which is listed here as 23.98. We round up. This is essentially going to give you the most real-time footage. Essentially, this is what movies are shot in, 24 frames a second. However, you can record in 30 frames per second if you want to. That is better for things like Instagram sometimes, but I personally prefer 24 frames a second, so I'm gonna stick with 4K at 24 frames. If you go down one more option, you do have the high frame rate option. This is going to record at full HD 120 frames per second. This is going to give you slow motion footage, which is really great for all that creamy B-roll if you're filming any kind of B-roll-y kind of a thing. This is really great for fast moving stuff that maybe you want to slow down. It's slow motion. Slow motion looks cool. You do have that option with this camera. All you have to do is switch it to enabled, but for this, we're gonna leave it off because we don't need to record any slow motion footage right now. And the last option on the first page is your sound recording. Now, because this is a basics video, we're going to just go ahead and leave this on auto. You can go in there and switch to manual and adjust it however you need. But again, that's a little more complex on what you need to do. So again, we're just gonna leave it on automatic mode. We actually are gonna skip over page 2 because we don't need anything on that page. And we're gonna go to page 3, which has white balance. Now, you can think of white balance essentially as how warm or cold your image is gonna look. Our eyes do this automatically, but we need to tell the camera what temperature the light is, more or less. Now, this can get more complicated with a Kelvin scale, but the Canon R50 makes it really, really easy for us. There is auto mode as the first option, but we're gonna avoid that one because I don't like to put auto white balance in video footage because that looks really weird if it's shifting while you're recording. So we're gonna ignore that option. And they have these nifty little pictures. We got daylight, we got shade, cloudy, tungsten, and fluorescent. So basically, just depending on what environment you're in, for example, this is a sunny environment, so we would choose the sunny daylight option. It really is as easy as that. If suddenly you're shooting in a shady environment, go ahead and go back to your white balance settings and select the shade option, or if it's cloudy, select the cloudy option. And the last thing we need to worry about on this page is the picture style. Now, this is essentially like your Instagram filters for your camera. This is gonna determine how it looks in terms of how the colors look. For me, I prefer the neutral picture profile just because it looks, well, neutral. But you can go through each and every one of these to see what you like. Standard, portrait, landscape, faithful, and monochrome, monochrome being black and white. Okay, now that we have our menu settings set up how we need in order to record video, let's go ahead and talk about the exposure tools, which we have at the bottom of the camera. The one on the left-hand side, that is our shutter. Now remember, we have our shutter dial here on the top. That's how we can control that, just by rotating it left or right. You can also control it on the touchscreen, which is really handy. Now, when it comes to shutter speed, what's great about shooting with video is that you essentially want to leave it at a specific setting and then never touch it again. That makes it really handy. Now, what number do you leave it at? Well, it's pretty easy to figure out. Whenever you select your frame rate, in this case, we're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want to lock your shutter speed to be double the number of your frame rate. So 2 times 24 is 48. Now this camera doesn't do 1/48th, so we're actually gonna select 1/50th because that's the closest number. That is 2 times our frame rate. If we were shooting at 30 frames per second, then we would want to move it over 1 to a 1/60th, which will be exactly double 30 frames per second. So once you have that set, you just leave that alone and you don't need to touch it anymore. The next exposure tool next to our shutter is our f-stop, or our aperture. Now this is essentially controlling how wide or small the iris is inside the camera, almost like the iris of your eye. So the larger the iris is, the more light gets in, and the smaller the iris is, the less light gets in. It's counterintuitive, but the smaller the number is, in this case f4, the wider the iris is, so it's letting in more light, therefore the brighter your image is. If you move it to a higher number, like f11 or f13 or f whatever, it's going to be smaller, letting less light in, therefore your image gets darker. Now this has another effect. It doesn't just control the exposure, it also controls how much bokeh or blurriness, if you want to call it that, is in the background of your footage. So if I'm filming my brother, for example, and he's in focus and I'm shooting at f4, you'll notice that there is some blurriness to the background behind him. However, if I switch it to f10, you'll notice that there's less blurriness and more is in focus. So the background will also be in focus as well as my brother. So more things are in focus if you are shooting at a higher aperture. So this one is really up to personal preference, whether you want everything to be in focus or you want less to be in focus. I personally prefer more bokeh in my images, so I typically try to stick closer to the widest aperture possible, in this case, f4. And the last exposure tool we have in this camera is going to be our ISO. Now you can think of ISO almost like fake light. Okay, so the higher the number is with your ISO, it starts at 100 and goes way, way higher, the more sensitive the camera is to light, therefore the brighter it gets. But this is fake, this is artificial. There's nothing functional in the camera happening in order to make your image brighter. So by doing this, we're actually degrading the image. So the higher the ISO number is, the noisier it gets and the less pleasing the image will look. So as much as possible, we want to keep our ISO as low as possible, in this case, ISO 100. So you're gonna use a combination of these three settings in order to expose your image. Again, leave your shutter speed more or less alone. Once you double it, your frame rate, your aperture, that'll go either which way, whatever you prefer. Then your ISO, you kind of do want to keep as low as possible. Now, one of the things that makes the Canon M50 great is that you don't actually have to go into the menu system to be able to change a bunch of the settings. You can also just click this Q button up at the top touchscreen, which is essentially your quick access menu. And here you can change things like your frame rate and your resolution. You can change whether or not you want to be in manual movie mode or you want to go into automatic movie mode. You can change things like your picture profile and your white balance, and all of this is accessible right here on the touchscreen, which is really fantastic. Now, what's great about the Canon R50 is that it has pretty good autofocus. As you can see, it has found my brother's face and it's locked on its own. It's doing a wonderful job, but it is a touchscreen and we can control that focus simply by touching anywhere else. So if I touch the background, now my brother's out of focus. And then if I touch back on my brother's face, now he is in focus again. So that is how you use the autofocus. You just touch the screen anywhere you want. It's very responsive and it works great. Now, those are the essentials for setting up the video settings in your camera and also exposing for video. One thing I didn't mention that maybe I should mention is how you actually record is you press the red record button. That'll start your record, and then when you press it again, it'll stop your record, saving your movie clip in the camera. And again, you can just hit the playback button to see the different videos that you have taken over the day. But now we're gonna go ahead and go over just some basic fundamentals on how to shoot photos with your Canon R50. Lucky for us, it is very, very similar to video, just with a few minor changes. So in order to switch it into photo mode, all we're going to do is switch it from the video icon to the M icon for manual photos. Now, again, just like with videos, if you're a bit newer and you wanna just move it into the auto mode, that's plenty fine. There's no shame here. But if you want to learn how to control your camera proper, I would go ahead and move it into the manual photo mode using the mode dial. So if we hop over into the menus of the R50 in photo mode, you'll notice that the first page has changed a little bit. That's because we lost our movie recording options and now we have photo taking options. The first one is called image quality. So if we go ahead and click into that, you'll notice that the top one says RAW and the one below says JPEG. Now those are the different file formats that you can take photos in. RAW is going to be the more professional option. It's going to take raw photos, but you are going to have to process those on your computer using things like Lightroom or something along those lines. So that's definitely the professional option. I'm not gonna recommend that for beginners. So we're gonna go ahead and turn that off by clicking on the little dash icon. Right below is JPEG. Now, this is the more consumer profile. So what you see on your screen when you snap the photo is what you're gonna get out in the computer, which is great. So for this, you have a bunch of different options. It seems confusing, it's really not. You essentially have small, medium, and large options. So that's how much resolution the photo has. So if your computer has a lot of space, go ahead and shoot on large. If your computer has less space, maybe shoot on medium or small, probably just medium though. And that's just, again, the size of the file that you are taking. So in this case, we're gonna select the large JPEG format and we're good to go. So we're gonna go ahead and skip over all these other settings, go straight to page 4, with white balance. Now, I know before I was saying I don't like my white balance to shift around while I'm taking videos, but that's because they're continuous. A photo is just one frame. So actually, if you're a beginner, I would just go ahead and leave it in auto white balance and let the camera kind of do whatever it needs to do. If it's getting a little bit funky and you know you're going to be shooting in daylight, of course, go ahead and set it to daylight or shade or cloudy. But again, auto white balance does a pretty dang good job when it comes to taking photos. So now let's get out of the menus and go back to just the regular screen on the Canon R50. There's only a few things that I would change when it comes to exposure with photography versus videography. That being that the shutter speed no longer needs to be fixed at double your frame rate because there is no frame rate. So you're free to use that shutter wherever you need to do to expose your image. The only thing that I like to do with my shutter speed is to never let it go below 1/100th of a second. It's not that you can't, it's just that if you're shooting, the shutter's closing at a speed to where maybe some of your hand movements gets translated into your image. Long story short, it just means that your image is gonna look a little blurry, not very pleasing. So go ahead and make sure that your shutter, as a general rule of thumb, is above 1/100th of a second. Other than that, everything else is the same. Aperture still works in the exact same way, and so does ISO. ISO is that fake light or light sensitivity for your camera. So now instead of exposing with the aperture or with your ISO, we're gonna kind of leave those mostly wherever we prefer them to be. For my case, I prefer ISO 100. And then for my aperture, it's gonna either be more wide open if I'm shooting portraits, or it could be more like f11 if I'm shooting a landscape because I want more things in focus. So you make that creative decision and then you expose with your shutter instead. So if it's really bright, maybe you'll be at shutter 500. Or if it's getting pretty dark, you might be closer to that shutter 100. If it's really, really dark and you need that extra light, go ahead and expose with your ISO to give you that extra bit of space. By the way, I've talked a lot about exposure, but maybe you don't know exactly how to tell whether or not your exposure is any good. Well, luckily we have a light meter here at the bottom, right in between all of our different exposure settings. If it's not there, all you gotta do is half press in the shutter and it usually will appear. And you'll see this little dot there at the bottom that is telling you where your exposure is. So if I crank it this way, you'll see it goes up because it's getting overexposed, +3, that's really bad. But then if I crank my shutter this way, oh no, it's getting way too dark, it's -3, that's bad too. So you want that to be kind of in the center, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower, it depends on your situation. So you can also gauge it by looking at the screen, but you want it to be somewhere near the center. Okay, so now I'm going to demonstrate how you can connect your phone to your camera wirelessly so that you don't have to use a computer in order to pull the images off of your camera. So we're gonna go back into the menus and navigate over to the purple settings. These are going to be the settings that you need to use in order to connect your phone to your camera. It's really easy. We just need to be on page 1 and click on the first option, which is connect smartphone to camera. Next, we're gonna select add device in order to initiate this process. By the way, you're going to need an app called Camera Connect so that you can connect your phone to your R50. Go ahead and make sure that's open. Now in the app, it's going to automatically detect the camera. So all you're going to need to do is click on where it says EOS R50 and then a series of numbers, whichever your camera says. After choosing your camera, just tap the pair button. Now back in the camera menu, just hit next to confirm your choice. And after just a brief moment, everything is connected. In the Camera Connect app, go ahead and select import images. From here, you can navigate through all your images on your SD card and find the important shots that you need on your phone. At the bottom of the screen, just select the import button and it'll automatically start saving it into your Photos app on your smartphone. And that's it. Of course, you can still traditionally just pop out the SD card and then load it up into an SD card reader on your computer and pull them off that way. But this is just another way that you can pull the images off your camera without the need of a computer or other equipment. Okay guys, so this has been my beginner's guide tutorial on how to get started using the Canon M50, this nifty little camera. Hope that you all found it useful. If you did, definitely drop me a like. Now, if you do have further questions, because there are lots of things that I definitely did not cover with this camera. For example, did you know that you can adjust how the EVF looks and focuses right here, depending on your different types of vision? There's lots of things that maybe you don't know about this camera still that we could talk about. So ask me in the comments down below. I hope that you all have a fantastic week and I will see you all in the next one. Take it easy, guys.